Good afternoon, audience, Arktos Academy channel. Today we are doing introduction to the historiography of the First World War. So the way that historians have looked at the First World War, the Great War as it used to be known. And we are going to be investigating the kind of bibliography that Hans Vogel, my colleague, and I have studied, the criticisms that we have towards it, and the alternatives that we are looking to in a revisionist perspective. So both of us, in a certain sense, are interested in revising mainstream history, which is one of the reasons, of course, that we are both banned from regular academy and working for Arktos Academy at the moment. The dissident right has been doing historiographical corrections, historical revisionism already since the 60s. A lot of progress has been made. A lot of source material is already available, but a lot of work remains to be done. I have been trying to make my own modest contribution by writing an introduction to the First World War, overviewing the events that led up to it, to the larger historical factors that contributed to it. And today I'll be joined by my Dutch colleague, Hans Vogel. We, of course, excuse our accents, but we think that Dutch accented talk about the First World War is better than mainstream talk about the Great War. And Hans, of course, is also a military historian, one of the very few in Holland. And of course, a Dutch perspective has another advantage. Most of our listeners will be coming from countries that are themselves have a history in the Great War, that were fighting on one side or the other, willingly or not. But that does not apply to the Dutch. So the Dutch, they did fight in the Second World War, but they were neutral in the First. And this gives us, of course, a certain kind of a neutral position that is to an advantage of any historian, because our view can probably be considered a little bit less colored than those of historians of participating nations, who, of course, always have some kind of allegiance to their nation, historical or in the present. Hans, thank you for joining me for this colloquium on First World War bibliography, historiography. Can you give me some of the an outline about your background, what you were reading about this conflict, and what you found valuable, and what struck you in the bibliography? What do you think?
Well, first of all, let me explain to you, I'm a historian. And history is not as I always stress, it's not a science not a hard science, not an exact science. It is like Giambattista Vico, the Italian philosopher of the 18th century, said, it's a coscienza, it's a co-science, or a conscience, like it's a joke on play on words, of course. And the methods are the same as in hard sciences, but the data that you work with are necessarily not the same, because the data that you handle often have to be regarded as the best you can get so far. You always have to be ready to adopt new data. Okay, so and fresh data do come up every now and then, not always, because data sort of disappear over time. But they may happen, they may just sort of coincidentally come up, which forces you to reconsider your view of certain periods. And I think this is one thing. And the second thing I want to say about my attitude in this regard, and probably the same as yours, is that a long time ago, when my colleague, my German colleague Horst Pietschmann, who was a famous historian of Latin America, he said, if you're a historian, you should always look where other people do not look. When people look in one direction, you should always look in the other direction. I've always instinctively done this, but he apparently did also. So it's an attitude that you look for things that in a direction where other people do not look at. So which gives you the opportunity to discover things that other people cannot see or don't see or do not want to see. So that's why from nature on, I have a tendency to look for things, to see things that other people do not, which gives me always a different perspective on many issues from most of my colleagues and most of my the people in my environment, okay, academic or otherwise. So this is I think is a very healthy attitude for a historian, because otherwise you just repeat the same old sawn-off stories and go on forever. And I also want to remember Huizinga, to sort of call into refer to Huizinga, the Dutch historian, Huizinga, Huizinga, or whoever he's called in other languages, the great cultural historian, who said that every generation needs to rewrite history, which is also something that we need to keep in mind. And only the revisionists among us have a tendency to rewrite history and to look in directions where most of their colleagues do not look. So this is sort of a general attitude that only very few people have. And I want to stress also that as soon as you have displayed this sort of attitude, most of the people in academic environments will shun you and will say, wow, that's not true. And how can you say this? And because they're reluctant to adopt other attitudes and other points of view. Also because they think it will make their positions in academia weaker, which is people have to pay mortgages and have to pay the rent and have to pay to pay for their car and this sort of thing, and they have families that need to be fed. So this sort of attitude of fears in the background make that people are very reluctant in general, more so than ever, I think, to look for new new angles and new focuses for issues that have been around us for a long time and that need to be reinvestigated and researched continuously. That's sort of what I wanted to say.
Well, cultural historical approach, like Huizinga's, is exactly what I've been trying to apply to, let's say, the prehistory,
Indeed,
the prologue to the Great War. I call it like that because I think it is far more important as a conflict, as a set of events in European history than the Second World War. So I call it the Great War. And the cultural historical perspective is exactly what I've been schooled to do, trained to do.
Yes.
But I do try to respect, let's say, the professional historical perspective. So I've read some, let's say, people that have set standards for history writing in our country. That is a famous Dutch historian called Jacob Presser.
Yes.
He was hiding in the...
Very good one.
Yeah, in the Second World War, he was hiding. And that he used the time that he had to write a quite nice book about cultural historical approach to the 80-year war that gave Holland its independence, and all the Netherlands became a republic through that war. And in the introduction to that book, he wrote a very useful description of how history is written sequentially, and that ties into what you are saying. So he says there is a lyric phase, the phase in which an event is experienced. Then there is an epic phase, just following the lyric phase, in which people's emotions, in which people's experiences are very much alive, but are not just experienced, are also cognitively being processed. Then, of course, after that, there is a dramatic phase, which writes a kind of a meta-narrative, starts to go towards a meta-narrative. And that phase is finally followed by a kind of an antithesis, let's say, the scientific phase, the scientific description, but more distant, not necessarily serving the same narrative as the dramatic phase. But of course, each of those phases, including the scientific phase, are linked up to the generational shifts that happen after a specific set of events, in this case, the Great War. So you can say the lyric phase ended at the moment that the war ended. The epic phase probably ended when a next set of great events, the Second World War, took over and a new generation appeared, also professionally writing history. So let's say 1940. And then there is the dramatic phase, the phase in which the generation that experienced the Great War is going towards its last phase. So that would end probably around 1970. And from that point onwards, we are in the scientific phase. If you use the model of Presser. That means that we are already in the scientific phase for a very long time. Like 1970, that's the time of the Fisher thesis, the scientific approach to the Great War. Since then, multitude of monographs has been written about the subject, mostly about parts of the war, economic history, let's say cultural essays, and also lived history is being rewritten from memoirs, but with a very scientific, objective approach. And I now propose that its time has come for a next phase, a synthetic phase, a phase in which also the scientific approach is left behind, because I do believe that that scientific approach, no matter how objective it claims to be, also serves a certain narrative. It fits into a certain period, a certain system that has been built up by the victors of the Great War, of course, eventually. And I think it's time to leave that behind, and it's time to break out also of that frame, because that's a frame as well. You say, Hans, you said, every generation needs to write its own history. So that hasn't happened for a very long time with the Great War. Like say 1970, there has been no original idea breaking through the frame that has been put by the scientists since that time. There's no breakout from that. There's no grand narrative, no meta-narrative, no, let's say, new mythological look. Of course, I agree with what you said. You said history is not a science as such, even if it's approached scientifically. It stays an art, right? It is under the protection of one of the muses.
Absolutely. Yes.
I would like your take on that. Why do you think that last phase, that so-called scientific phase, that one view, that one approach to the conflict has lasted for such a long time? I mean, we're talking about half a century almost now already. What's your view on it?
Well, of course, it's good to underline or to keep in mind that history in let's say Western Europe, most of Europe, most of what is now Europe, has been part of the American empire after the Americans occupied and conquered it in 1943, 44, 45. And the Americans, as I always stress, the Americans do not think historically. Americans fundamentally think that they are outside of history. They are a shining city upon a hill. And their constitution is also written in such a way as to assume that America, the United States, is outside of history. It is something totally new. And Americans have a disregard for history, but I would say even more, they don't even realize what history is. They have no idea. And for them, there's only one version of events, and that's their version. And when it's events in the past that we call history, it's part of their ideology. And the Americans have consistently maintained a certain view of our past, of Europe's history, which is now part of Americans, or the American way to see the world. Everything in Europe, all European historians and academics were limited by a framework of sort of constraints imposed by the Americans, I think. And that is why the history of the First World War is so absolutely boring and so it's absolutely the same. All people write the same thing. it's basically the introduction of to the opening of Europe to American domination. And the domination has sort of was sort of it began in the First World War, and it was sort of limited, rounded off in the Second World War by the American conquest of Europe. And since then, Europe has been going downhill and being systematically destroyed. Its culture destroyed by the Americans. This is not because I don't like Americans, because I studied there. There's many Americans individually I like very much, but America as a culture, I think it has no place in history because they don't consider it themselves part of history. So, and I think we should leave it. And it's a strange way of looking at other people. America is the best place in the world, and all the others are nothing. And that's basically this attitude sort of permeates Europeans' work writing on historical topics, even especially sort of 20th century history, beginning with the First World War. Don't you agree with me?
Yes. So you're talking about a very static approach to history, not like a living organism, not like a living art or science, but rather like an endpoint, a set standard narrative. I think that really touches the reality. As I said, this so-called scientific stage of historiography is already lasting a very long time. It's exactly the time, what you are saying, that matches US dominance of Europe. But I do think it ties into an earlier tradition, earlier Anglo-Saxon tradition, British tradition, which is called and is widely known as Whig historiography.
Whig, yes.
Yes, so W-H-I-G, it used to be an indication for a certain political party, which has a very clear, it has a telos in mind, an end goal. And it argues back from that ideological end goal and argues, you can see that, for example, in the writings of Churchill very strongly, everything is leading up to this perfect end state. And that end state is being created and propelled by Anglo-Saxon sea power. Of course, in Churchill's day, he had still much more integrity as a historian, but he does have that attitude. It fits into that Whig historiographical tradition. And I think it is a very, let's say, ideological tainted perspective, right? It also serves a purpose. Let's not forget, it's not just the utopian end view of history that is now, let's say, American imposed, but it's also the underlying assumptions, which are Anglo-Saxon, which are mercantile, which have been permeating continental European historiography, exactly like you said, since the Anglo-Saxons won the war, the first Great War, and the so-called Second World War after that. And I think because there is no other perspective available in European historiography at the moment, at least not outside of the margins, that allows that discourse, that narrative, that let's say foundational narrative of that telos to dominate, completely dominate historiography.
I agree.
And even influence art. Now there have been, of course, some other forms of historiography, but they have been happening, let's say, or on the margins, like revisionists, or in other areas of the world. So, for example, the Soviet Union had its own approach to history writing, which was quite different, but of course also teleological. It has its own end goal that it described. Can you say something more about that telos that you see in that, if you agree with what I say, in that Whig historiography and the American historiography that came out of it? What do you think about that?
Well, I think what you say basically is that what is being done with this perspective, the kind of historiography, is not historiography. That's historiography as part of an ideological framework. So it stands outside the field of history. is not real history. If you have this approach, real history is looking at facts, looking at the general picture, and trying to make sense of the facts and put them in a story, try to make sense of it, and you try to let the facts speak for themselves. That's history. That's writing history. Writing history is not you have an idea and you take some facts, you select some facts here and there to fit your discourse, your point of view, and use them at will. That's not history. And that's, unfortunately, that's the kind of history that was being done in the Soviet Union because it was Marxism. That's the kind of history that was done in dictatorships, and that's sort of everything logically, and in the kind of, sort of societies that the English and the Americans have developed, and that they have imposed on a large part of Europe. Because European history, if you look at great French historians, great German historians, from even Pirenne, the great Belgian historian, that's of a different kind. It's a different, like a breath of fresh air that comes into your mind if you read the great works of great German and French and Dutch and Belgian historians, and you don't have the sense from reading Whig historians or American style historians. Very few of them, and if it's all ideological, and ideology is very boring, basically. That's what I think. So that's my take on things. And I think part of the problem in Europe is that due to the Anglo-Saxon dominance of Europe, which is the fact that we're speaking in English today, although with the Dutch accent, is proof of what I'm saying, that most Europeans today, when they speak a language that's not their own language, it's English. And my parents, your parents, they used to be able, we ourselves, we can still speak German and French. We can converse in French and German. Most of our sort of colleagues from the same age and friends from the same age, they're not able to do so. We're sort of exceptions to the rule. But there was a time, not so long ago, maybe not even 100 years ago, when every educated European could speak German and French, and not English, because English is not considered a language for business transactions and not a language for academic pursuits. So Europeans had a different attitude. And of course, the language that you speak and that you write in and that you think in colors what you say and what you write. There's this whole sort of cultural load, sort of baggage that comes with the language. And when you read German and French, and when you talk in French and German, you get also, you have a different angle of looking at things. And most Europeans today, when doing historical research, they're not able to read French and German. So they rely on English and English translations of European works written in German and French. The idiots. I said, that's stupid. It's sheer stupidity. Not to speak of other languages like Italian or Spanish or Russian or Polish or Swedish, or the language that are very important. Hungarian, which I don't speak, but which is an important language. And I'm sure things have been written in Hungarian that are sort of vital for the understanding of the First World War. I don't have access to. You have, but I don't. Sort of. So but people today, especially the younger generations, but also people of our generation, they don't even realize how much how sort of handicapped they are because of the limited linguistic knowledge. And this sort of is a grave problem, and this will have to be sort of solved. Otherwise, Europeans will be forever repeating the Anglo-Saxon version of their own past, I think.
Well, you brought up two very important points. So the first is the way that the medium influences the message. So that can be quite linguistically true. I'm struck by the fact that the country where I am now, it's Greece, of course, a place where European history writing was born, Herodotus. It possesses a language that is very productively analytical. This means you can create new words very easily. most, of course, of our scientific jargon in Europe is derived from Greek. And you can see the whole different approach to reality if you approach things through that language. The words shape the reality. So that is certainly true, but you also brought up another important point, and that is the passage of time and the way the generational perspective that Europeans used to have is being eroded. So that now for a very long time, we are already living under this hegemon, I would call it a hegemon, the Anglo-Saxon thalassocratic sea power-based international hegemon that, of course, translates now into globalism. You and me still belong to a generation that spoke, when we were young, to people who were alive during the Great War, who were consciously alive, maybe as young people, but alive during that time. So I've spoken to, let's say, old people in my youth that still see the German emperor, the last German emperor, or who still experienced what it was when armies passed through their city, or in my own country, Holland, who experienced rationing, and what kind of refugee problems arose when people crossed the border, real refugees, people who lost their houses from Belgium who came to stay 4 years in Holland. So that experience is still with us. And of course, people of our generation who are academically schooled also still have a command of other languages, can access resources, but these things are fading away. So that living link is fading away. And also, let's say the access to the medium, the language medium is fading away. But there is a third problem. We are now also in a situation that written material is subject to change. So previously we were talking about paper books that you could touch, that you could smell, that you could judge on its age just by looking at the paper. But now we are going into a format where people access history mostly on so-called online, which has a very big danger in it, because books can be altered as far as they are not facsimile proven. They can be altered, they can be erased, they can be censored, which is happening at a large scale. So I think we are facing a perfect storm in Europe concerning our history. We are actually in the danger of losing our own history and being left with that, let's say, that very limited and very ideologically tainted Anglo-Saxon Whig historiography that was built up around the victor's discourse, right? They say history is written by those that hang others. Well, that's nowhere more true than in Europe, where people after wars were literally being hanged and where history couldn't be written correctly. Even it's a punishable offense in many European countries still.
Yes.
And I think this is a very grave danger that we are in. That's also why I decided to write, with whatever limited resources I have, this book series that I start. Yes. So I call it the traditionalist history of the Great War, because traditionalism is a school of thought, a hermeneutic system developed largely in Europe based on European tradition. And it allows for a wholly different approach. And I was thinking it is better to give a wholly different and authentic approach than to be stuck with that one specific so-called academic discourse now. What do you think is the correct way ahead for European historians? What do we have to do to get ourselves out of this perfect storm? What are suggestions that you have for young people to reclaim real European history for themselves?
Well, that's from what I said earlier. Learn German and learn to read German. Learn French and learn how to read French, and learn 2 other languages like Spanish, Italian, or some of the great European languages. Because if you can read those languages, you're less dependent on even on the manipulation of sources these days, because you always go back to printed sources that are available in libraries. And I know that some countries like the Ukraine, they're trying to destroy everything that refers to Russia by destroying libraries, the Russian materials in libraries, which is of course that's the European values, as the Dutch Prime Minister says. and that's our values, as he says. He probably is right, because the values of the people of his ilk are to destroy the collective consciousness and the collective memory of great numbers of people in Europe. So that's European ideals these days, your Western ideals of Western values. But where those values, the true Western values are still, European values are still in place, especially in regional libraries, smaller ones, you will find treasures of documents, books and sources in languages that very few people can read today. Because most students, I can assure you, most students in Europe, in the Netherlands even, are unable to read German, let alone read German in Fraktur, printed between since from 1870 to 1940. They can't read that, which is this sheer stupidity. And they cannot read French, which is also a shame. And sort of recuperate those languages, because so much of what's valuable to European historians and to our field, the First World War, has been written in French and German, and it's not been translated. It's in the forgotten corner. It's disappearing into the memory hole. That's the first thing to recoup, to find sort of access, to regain access to those sources by learning the languages. That's the first thing I would do if I were a young student, or if I would advise younger students, do that. And then you'll have an advantage over the others. Because when I went to study in the United States, I studied in Florida for a couple of years. I did my PhD there and my master's. I was the only student who could read German and French and Spanish and Italian, and the others couldn't. They could read Spanish because it was in the Latin American department, but they could certainly not read French or German. And if you don't know the language, you can just forget it. You cannot study history. That's basically the message I would convey. Don't rely on just English, because that leads into a rabbit hole, a giant rabbit hole for a mega rabbit. So that's what I would say. So
yes, well, to give people an idea of how that is, to read other languages and to see the perspective on the war, in this case, the Great War, through other languages, other media. I can say that in my youth, you could still access very easily in secondhand bookshops original materials written either during the Great War or very shortly afterwards. Memoirs, overviews, or for example, print newspapers, magazines from that time. Yes. That you could simply, London Illustrated, this kind of things. You could get, let's say, source material quite easily and quite cheaply. That, of course, now has disappeared. So things have become antiquarian and supposed to be expensive, collector's items. But not only that, access to libraries also physically is more difficult. So, for example, one of the best libraries in Holland is the Royal Library in Den Haag. Well, try to get the actual physical material out from there. That's not that easy. You will be forced to study on the place itself for many source materials, and you'll be lucky if you have access to it. You might have to make an appointment because they only keep very few originals. So the access is getting more difficult. It is less natural coming to people. And then about the language medium. So I read things exactly like you said in the beautiful German old print from books that were published, let's say 1930, 1925. And if you read them, you got a whole different atmosphere of the war and of the look at the war than you get from standard Anglo-Saxon inspired literature. So Anglo-Saxon historiographical tradition is very, let's say, science-oriented, so-called, fact-based, they say, but in fact, it always is repurposed and retooled to serve a certain discourse. And sources and materials are always a very one-sided approach, very one-sided. Archives from other languages are not being approached. And if you read the German, what first of all always struck me is the much more objective way that things were looked at. So the Germans had a kind of a blunt approach. that even if things for them went badly in the war, they made mistakes. They didn't gloss them over. They actually said mistakes were made. This and these people were to blame. This
Absolutely.
went wrongly for us.
Yes.
And also they had a kind of an old, almost knightly, chivalrous attitude to the enemy. They could, for example, say, we were fighting with the British at the Somme, but and we won, but they were very brave. We appreciate their bravery, and we describe it in these terms. So it was a very, let's say, a much more balanced view attached to it. That's just the impression I got. I don't know if you agree with that.
I have the same impression. Exactly what you say. You get a sense of the Germans being very civilized and very generous towards the enemy. They're people like themselves, whereas the Anglo-Saxons tend to degrade the enemies that they fight.
Yes.
Because they cannot fight wars, basically.
What also it struck me is the very legalistic attitude that is taken by literature, including even memoirs written in Central Europe. So German and Austrian literature tends to be very legalistic when it comes to the causes of the war and the conduct of the war. So they go out of their ways to disprove allegations made against them of the misuse of international rules, of breaches of war law. They go out of their way to describe them in black books, in white books, and they really pay a lot of attention to those things. That also applies, by the way, to the French. The French try to do justice to the enemy in a certain sense as well. Although they, of course, are a bit more, let's say, passionate about their history in certain ways. But the legalistic continental European approach is something that struck me as a tone that is still preserved further east. So, for example, let's look at the conflict presently going on in Russia, Russia-Ukraine. If you listen to the Russians, you get this very legalistic approach. They breached Article so and so much. They didn't keep to these and these accords. They are not conducting themselves in accordance with rules such and such. They do not stick to the agreements made there and there. These are kind of very continental phrases, historiographical phrases that you find in literature written about the Great War in, let's say, Austria and Germany or further east. And you still see that in the Russian approach now. So it seems to me that this legalistic, very correct,
formal,
objective approach is still alive in certain corners. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, well, obviously, of course, you're right. I would even call it a formal approach, like a formalistic or formal approach, not legalistic, formal, which is, I think, is a more better word, a better word for this, what you're describing. And I think it proves that Russians are part of European culture. And it also proves that if European culture survives today, it survives in Russia. That's I mean, even because they have not succumbed to the climate lunacy and the gender lunacy that is sort of rampant in the West as tools of the American domination apparatus of Europe. And Russia is free of that, and good for them. And that's also, I think, the reason why so many Europeans are flocking now to Russia to find a better future for themselves and their children, because Russia is where Europe is still survives. I think the more you read about what happened in the Ukraine and the war and all around it, and you hear the blatant idiocies that the politicians in the West blabber out, and sort of you realize that we're in a complete madhouse, in a lunatic asylum in the West, and where there's no rules, everything goes, there's no rules anymore, and that's and there are still rules in Russia, rules and laws, and that's why you have a legalistic or a formal approach to history, or also and to events, I think. So I agree with you. Yes,
I agree that there's, of course, the word formalistic is the correct word here. It has a legal component, but it's formalistic. Almost it strikes me sometimes as naive. For example, you have this Italian historian of diplomacy, Albertini. He has written a great book about the origins of the Great War by reconstructing the diplomatic events preceding it. And he goes into the utmost detail to find out who exactly made what mistake on what day during the July crisis. And he really goes to all the sources and he cross-references them and he gets comments from everybody to just re-establish, like a detective, the chain of events. So very painstaking, very formalistic. All through his country went to war on the side of the Allies, the Entente, eventually. He goes to great lengths to prove, to show what really happened. And he doesn't assign blame based on the outcome. He doesn't say, okay, we won, so we were correct and the enemy was wrong, like what happens in the Anglo-Saxon, let's say, tradition. And I think this is, but it strikes me on the other hand also as very naive. So this is an aristocrat going into correspondence with his colleagues and digging out their memoirs and doing his utmost best to be honest. Something similar you can see in German sources. So, for example, the Germans went to great length to prove that the British imposed hunger blockade on their country was a war crime, and they did their utmost best to prove the point by documents, whatever they could find. Many, many years later, the Royal Navy and the British government, they opened their archives and they showed policy documents from that time, proving the German point, proving that this was a purposefully meant hunger blockade, even, for example, targeting certain age groups. For example, this and this age group coming up for military service next year should be targeted by vitamin deficiency, by, for example, blocking this and this and this kind of food that should not be imported to Germany, that should be blocked.
Diabolical.
Yeah. So it is proven now beyond any shade of a doubt. And you see that many years earlier in Italian and German historiography, that people are busy to prove these points very painstakingly. But it strikes me, Hans, as very, let's say, naive, like somebody that is innocent and is trying to prove in front of a judge his innocence. But he is faced with a court of opinion that is highly biased and unlikely to ever give him his rights. How do you look at that?
Well, of course, the problem here is that when you come to such a conclusion and you write a book about it, most people, when they're German or Italian, they will not write in English, so they will write in their own language. So when you write in those languages, you don't reach a bigger public, even if you write in English, and they don't like what you write. Your book will be banned by Amazon, as happens to Arktos's books, of course. So the hammer and anvil of censorship will take care of many efforts to sort of break through the wall, the wall and the barbed wire protecting the sacrosanct version of history as condoned by the Anglo-Saxon or the American empire in Europe. That's of course, that's why it's sort of you find the sort of this naive attitude, this naive tone, as you described correctly. But I think the only thing to do is like in a kind of Siamese dot, like to produce something underground in Europe that sort of runs counter to the official narrative, because the official narrative is just hogwash. Basically, it's hogwash. It's a fairy tale. It's a fairy tale with a bad ending for us. The American version of history, or the Whig version of European history. It's a fairy tale with a bad ending for all of us in Europe. That's why we should try to combat it with other means, with more subtle means, maybe shorter pamphlets or other things, maybe films, or maybe memes. I don't know, but there must be a way to subvert this sort of thing. And I think the repression will be even worse in the coming years, because when you look around and read what sort of the news, not in the official channels, but in the alternative channels, you see that totalitarianism is showing its ugly face ever more pronouncedly in Europe. So I don't see, I'm not very optimistic, but I think resistance is necessary. And we're part of the resistance, I must say.
Well, I think that so the historiography of the Second World War is affecting that of the First. So it's like a backward argument that I see. For example, if you look at statements made by British statesmen, I'm talking not the hired hands like Winston Churchill, but people that belong to the government in the years till 1938, 37, historians as well. There are many of those British statesmen that were quite sympathetic to the German plight, who understood that the amount of blame assigned to the Germans for the First World War was not correct, and that the measures taken after the war, the so-called peace settlement, was not a peace settlement, but a real diktat and very unreasonable. And they also had a very balanced view of, let's say, what happened in the war. They were like a little bit more British aristocratic sportsmen-like. They said, okay, we won the war, but they didn't invalidate, let's say, the discourse coming out of Germany from revisionists there, from people that wanted to stand up against the Allies, the Allied imposed peace settlement. So it was a more respectful attitude towards Germany, towards the defeated powers. But after the Second World War, you get that very strange imposition of the view of the Second World War imposed on the First. So the same.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah. So the reasoning backward, if the Germans were bad, they were the villains of the Second World War. They were also the villains of the First. There was like this continuity. There was like this almost inherited guilt. And of course, this has fed in also into the inherited guilt thesis that is now dominating Germany after the Second World War. And I think this poisons the well, because so looking backward and imposing anachronistically ideas about Germany that arose during the Second World War, or even misconceptions, it doesn't matter, but the views of it, superimposing them backwards on the First World War Germany, that was, of course, a very, it's like you are thwarting and you are distorting and even falsifying history. I think that's another problem.
But that's the Hollywood approach.
Yeah,
I mean, because basically, as the Argentinian singer Piero, who's a great singer, in his song Los Americanos, which I invite everybody to listen to, and there's also an English translation that you can download, which is a great song. He says Americans have learned their history from those fantastic, finely sort of tasteful American movies from Hollywood. That's how they learn history, and basically that's the way it is. Because now there's no more Hollywood, so it's Netflix or whatever they're called. It's just hogwash. It's just nonsense. It's absolute nonsense. It's fairy tales, and that's the kind of history that children are taught in schools, that people are taught in universities, that academic researchers engage in. It's all hogwash. It's all fantasy. It's all a fairy tale. That's the the problem, because basically there is no more history. There is no more historical writing in Europe, save for a few people that do honest work. But as far as I'm concerned, what I see, it's all hogwash, most of it. Well, most of it, and the few things that are worthwhile are often published outside the academic circuit. And that's which reminds me of Argentina, because Argentina was the same thing, and they had few people know this, because they had a very influential small group of revisionist historians that developed in the early years of the 20th century, very influential, and eventually were successful in providing a valuable alternative to the standard academic history, which is also romantic and fake and fantasy filled as in Europe. But in Argentina, the revisionists managed to really change the official discourse, which in Europe has not happened yet, but we might be able to do that eventually.
Well, one other thing that struck me about Great War, First World War historiography, is the way it really misrepresents the real state of power relations on the eve of the war and during the war. So it's like this, the narrative, let's say the standard academic narrative, the standard Anglo-Saxon narrative that dominates Europe. It's like there are two equal parties, of which one is bad and the other is good. And the good wins, of course, over the bad.
Of course, yes.
Not because they are more powerful, but because they are good.
Yeah.
Miracles happen. So, for example, in the Second World War, you get the greatest hour, right? By a miracle, Britain is saved. The First World War, the same. You get the miracle of the Marne. But that doesn't take into account the real state of affairs. So, for example, the Battle of the Marne was a very unequal affair. The Germans being inferior in numbers, in logistics, in equipment, even at the time of the fight. And I think it's very well illustrated. The real state of affairs, the real balance of power is, to me, very well illustrated by what happened at sea. And then we come, of course, to that country that you love, Argentina. You can say, in a certain sense, that the real decision of the war was made at sea. So the one who dominates the world seas and who has access to what lies beyond the world seas, this means in America, it's in Africa, in Asia, this party that dominates the seas and those resources will win mathematically, certainly will win.
Yes.
That happened in the First, that happened in the Second World War, and near Argentina took place two battles. So beginning of the First World War, we have the Battle of the Falkland Islands.
Yes.
And beginning of the Second World War, the Battle of the River Plate. In both cases, a small, very small, puny German challenge to the almighty British Empire was beaten quite easily, actually. It was even of course, ruses were used and deceptions were used, as is legitimate in a war, but the just simple power balance is so preclusive. It precludes any kind of chance of the Germans ever winning either of those conflicts. And I think this says something about the real state of affairs. But if you look at mainstream academic historiography, that's just totally ignored. The real power balance, it is like ignored in favor of some kind of a moral balance. Like the moral weight is what decided the outcome of these conflicts. It had nothing to do with pure, let's say, mathematically deductible material circumstances. What is your take?
I fully agree with that, but that's you find also a bit of that in the skipping of the sort of the narrative on the Berlin-Baghdad railway, which to some is the main reason why the English decided to begin the First World War. They did not want a German controlled railway stretching from Berlin all the way to the Persian Gulf, enabling sort of to circumvent the Suez Canal as a main trade route from merchandise from the Far East to Europe and back and vice versa. And the English discomfort with the construction by the Russians of a railway through from the Caspian Sea to Central Asia, because the English were very much against that too. And that explains partly, I think, the Russian-Japanese war, because Japan was funded and paid and fomented by the English to fight to destroy the Russians, because they had this Trans-Siberian railway also, which the English didn't like at all. So the English were always very much against ties uniting Europe, continental Europe, with Asia, because it would destroy their control of their sort of their reliance on the seas as an instrument of power. So you're right in this, and that's why sort of because if you talk to the if you talk about the thalassocracy of the English and of the Americans later on in the Second World War, you also need to talk about the railways that were constructed and they were threatening this thalassocracy. And that would force you to look at a different way at all the events of the First World War and the Second World, of course, also. You see, so you see, if you stress this thing, it'll force you sort of automatically to adapt your overall narrative, which is impossible because the narrative is about good versus bad, as you said.
Yes, I think you brought up a very good point. In my the first book of my series called Sunset, Sunset of Tradition, I created an appendix covering the so-called 10 modern wonders of the world, including, of course, the Baghdad and Hejaz railways. And you're talking about the intercontinental connections opposing the thalassocratic connections, the seaborne connections. And this is, of course, a very important element in this conflict, explaining its course, explaining its result. Just a small aside. So the reason that railroad was not finished, one of the main reasons it wasn't finished in time, that means before the end of the war, it was that it had to be located in such a way that it was out of range of British naval gunnery. So it couldn't go next to the Mediterranean coast, let's say that small bay of Iskandar. That had to be circumvented by building a railroad through the mountains. That costed so much time and so much engineering effort that the tunnels were finished. I think it was a week, just a week before Turkey capitulated. Turkey, of course, being Germany's ally in the First World War. So that shows something. But I think you're saying you're bringing up a very interesting point, because that pattern, the pattern of the thalassocracies opposing any continental communications, intercontinental communication, is also something that we are seeing now. So the Chinese Road and Belt Initiative that has been started 10 years ago or more, and the Eurasian Economic Union and the integration of the BRICS economies, which are all centered on the world island, let's say, so the Eurasian landmass, and that focuses on building up literally infrastructure, rail infrastructure, road infrastructure, terminal infrastructure. This is something that probably has also a lot to do with the triggering of, let's say, the ongoing Cold Third World War. So the conflict between the thalassocracies ongoing now against the Eurasian states. Do you see that parallel as well? Do you have any thoughts on this?
I fully agree with you, and there are many aspects to that, and because there's this continuous attempt in the West, from all sides, from the left and the right, to put China in a bad light, to blackball China, to make it look like an evil place. And the same what they did with Russia and what they're doing with Russia. So everybody who opposes the sort of the American rules-based order, whatever it's called, the idiocy of the concept in itself is sort of mind-boggling. But you see that there's this conscious, consistent sort of evil dialogue, evil discourse on anybody who opposes the American world order. If he be from Africa, South Africa, North Africa, Arab Peninsula, Iran, China. That's always, and it's very subtle because it goes in many directions. The Chinese are all the same, and the government is evil, and the social control things, and they which they want to export to our areas here, or the no, you can or Iran, how they treat women and how they sort of the human rights in Iran, and not talking about Assange and about journalists being killed in Western Europe and United States. And I mean, this sort of thing, it's continuously, and it's so pervasive and so massive that people do not sort of cannot see it, fail to sort of, they cannot, sort of, it's impossible for them to see it. You only see it when you have been alerted to it, as we have. Okay, and then you can more or less discern what's going on. But as long as you don't see it, refuse to see it, do not believe what you see, what you really see, well, then there's no way out. And that's the power of propaganda, and that's all pervasive, thanks to television and but especially the internet and Netflix and whatever you. So
I think
it's very difficult. Yes.
I think you bring up. We brought up now the extension of, let's say, the standard discourse of standard academic narrative. So the bibliography of the Great War, the bibliography of the Second World War, how it is tainted. And we draw a line now to the present, in which the thalassocracy is still alive and kicking, doing very well, but again being challenged. But I think looking backwards, you can say there is also a continuity. So if we look at the way American, Anglo-Saxon historiography treats an example such as the Spanish American, it is just so propagandized. It is incredible. They have even a name for it. It's called, I think I don't pronounce it correctly, Legenda Negra. So
Legenda Negra.
Yeah,
yes.
The black legend. So
yes.
the evil Spanish associated with the Inquisition, with burnings, with unreasonability, with cruelty, suppressing the pure Cubans and who need to be liberated, of course, by the Americans. The same in the Philippines, apparently. Ignoring the fact that after the Americans took over there, both countries once erupted in a much longer guerrilla war against the Americans. But anyway, so there is some kind of continuity. I also look at the Boer War as a precursor to that. So the way that is framed, ignored in a certain sense, the atrocities committed by the English there against the native Boers. And I think the Legenda Negra even has precursors, let's say, in the Reformation. It even has precursors in the time that Elizabeth and England fought against the Armada, against Britain. And that you can see that also in Dutch books, so that Spain is not seen merely as a rival, but as the incarnation of evil, of cruel, wanton evil. And I think there is some kind of continuity even all the way back to that time, to the time of the Reformation, and all the way up to now, that whatever stands up to what comes out of Amsterdam, London, and out of New Amsterdam, called New York now, that whatever stands up against that somehow is painted with the brush of the Legenda Negra. It must be bad. And it is
by
bad.
By definition, absolutely.
Yes. So there is some kind of continuity. Would you agree that it is there is a continuity here of narrative?
Well, of course, we have been talking about this before, as I remember, and look. The fact is that the Dutch, of course, the Dutch elites in the 17th century, in the 16th century, they became Calvinist, and the English elites, the Church of England, they retained the Catholic liturgy, but they became they adopted Calvinist theology. Okay. And the Pilgrim Fathers that went to the United States were also Calvinists from this thing. I see, and Calvinists see themselves as the sort of the new Jews, or a new kind of Jews, and as especially enjoying a special benediction from God. Whatever they do is right because they do it. And that's how the Dutch look at the world. The English look at the world, especially the elites, as far as they're sort of tainted by Calvinism, and the Americans, because they inherently they're also of the same ilk as the Dutch and the English Calvinists. So, and they have retained this ideology, which is written by a French historian, Élise Marianne Strass, Les mythes fondateurs de la nation américaine, a wonderful book that sort of analyzes this entire dialogue from the earliest days of the Americans, from the 17th century, from the 1620s, down to this day. It's fantastic reading this book, but it took about 15 or 20 years for it to get a proper sort of discussion in an American historical journal, because it was always relegated. Sort of, they didn't want to recognize that it had ever appeared in America. So it is still relegated to the background. But look at it, Élise Marianne Strass, Les mythes fondateurs de la nation américaine, wonderful book, which describes everything like this. So and it's all clear when you read that. Sort of, you're right. Yes.
So there are still nations that, of course, preserve their independence, also in a historiographical sense. Russia, of course, obviously being one, but that also goes for Turkey. So if you come to Turkey, yes, the historiographical narrative about the Great War is totally rejected. If it comes to the causes of the war, the Turks will point out to the fact that they were robbed of ships bought with their national capital, with the blood, sweat, and tears of their nation. They ordered 2 great dreadnought ships from Britain that were impounded the moment the war broke out by no less than Winston Churchill, of course. That created a lot of bad blood and made the Turks already more susceptible, even more susceptible to German overtures, especially when they were combined with the gift of ships in return. Turks also reject the narrative about the Armenian Holocaust, the so-called Armenian genocide, pointing to the fact that there was real Allied interference in the eastern provinces, and there were real sabotage actions organized out of the population there, and that atrocities were committed on 2 sides. That's something that is not admitted in the West, but that's something that's maintained there. And they have even a very heroic tradition about themselves. So if you visit there, the Anzac monument that's built on the place near Gallipoli, you will get a guide, a Turkish guide, who will say that the Turks here heroically defended their own nation, and they will not praise the Allies for attacking them there. So that's a very different approach. The same you can see in Eastern Europe. So a country like Hungary, that's still suffering under the consequences of the Trianon Treaty. That's, of course, the treaty that settled the Great War for Hungary. They are still very dissatisfied with it, with monuments everywhere being put up, with maps of the old Hungary everywhere still hanging, even in shops and in people's private houses. So that narrative there, the standard European, Western European narrative, is not applicable there. It doesn't dominate in places such as this. But in the West, we really have a problem. Western Europe, also Holland, suffers from such a distortion in our academic education on this subject, and in the way history is still written on this subject, that I wonder, is it not time for a more radical approach? Because that very, I call it naive approach of just proving ad nauseam points that have been already proven over generations, of every time reinventing the wheel and showing the truth and painstakingly describing it. I think that's an exercise in futility, because in the end of the day, for the Anglo-Saxon hegemon, might is right. power is what that counts.
Absolutely.
And they simply will ignore whatever is being written by thinkers. I think here it's more important to act, to create a new system in which new bibliography, new historiography is possible at all. Because without that possibility, without that opening, what are we talking about? We are talking about a very marginal enterprise in rewriting historiography. What's your view of that? Do you think there's any sense in pursuing historiography without first solving this much greater issue of total hegemonic control over the whole of Western narrative in all spheres of life?
Yeah, well, I've also thought about that, and it's good that you put up this point. But with time, you see that the official discourse becomes more idiotic, and hubris it plays a part in this also. It's the same as politicians. When the longer they feel they're unopposed in whatever they say and emit in public, the more idiotic their pronouncements will become. And you see the same thing with history, because it's preposterous, the kind of history that's being taught us. If you look at the history handbooks that are used in Dutch universities, for instance, all American and all the same sort of black and white, simplistic, idiotic thinking, it's madness. And the longer this goes on and the more simplistic it gets, the more simplistic education will become, because education is so simplistic today that, I don't think people in the first year in university, at the end of the first year, have the same knowledge that we would have in gymnasium when we were in the fourth form, via gymnasium. We knew more about history and about the better sense of historical understanding when we were about 16, 17, than students today in first year university, I think. And I think I'm not exaggerating. So the more idiotic it'll become, the system will be impossible to maintain. And at the same time, you have this next to Europe, sort of next to Western Europe, US-dominated Europe, you have Russia, where they still have real universities, where they still get mathematics as they used to get it, where they still get history, where they still sort of try to incite discussion and try to make students think for themselves, as far as I understand. Okay, so the longer this contrast, the more pronounced it becomes, the more difficult it will be for the Western system to maintain itself, I think. So you see that everything is sort of and I'm optimistic, maybe too optimistic, but you see everywhere you look around you today in Europe, you see the decay, you see the collapse, you see things cannot go on like this, and you see that the authorities are getting nervous. Do you agree with me?
I think you're right. We are starting to reach some kind of saturation point, the saturation point of sheer absurdity. So if you, it is like you can see in private psychology, if people lie too much, they cannot at some point perceive truth anymore. And that becomes a real handicap. And I think that's happening collectively to our elite, let's say. Yes. Certainly to the media establishment has already happened, to the academic establishment that has happened even longer ago. I'm sure you're right in that. And I think the further that process of implosion, because it's also a process of cognitive implosion, of moral implosion progresses, the more that process progresses, I think the more, the least will be, let's say, the ability of people to pretend that everything is okay. So that to pretend participation in the education process, the academic process. You already can see young men en masse turning away from the humanities. Yes. Anybody that pursues a serious career has to think twice about participating in any humanity courses in the West. That's already for sure. I do think that there is some pressure from the outside necessary. I think that the Anglo-Saxon hegemon has proven to be only susceptible to one thing to change its narrative, and that's defeat. Defeat on the battlefield. I think that's what has to happen to them.
Yes, well, it's
They
happening
simply
now.
they simply need to get a bloody nose, and I
Yes.
think that will shrink their ego, and it will correct things. But the question is, of course, to what extent, at what point does that happen, and will our whole history have been rewritten by that point? Myself, I have tried in my books to start from what we call tabula rasa. So throw all of the let's say the narrative out of the window and start it completely again. And I did that by just rewriting very radically in a traditionalist fashion. So just start, reject the program that's being imposed, turn it around, and by 180% different perspectives, you are able to perceive more of the truth than you are by following the perspective that has been enforced so far. But of course, the censorship does not allow any voice of reason to reach a great academic public. I have noticed that, for example, my books are being read a lot in South America, in Peru, Brazil, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and in Asia, Japan, Korea, but not in Europe. They're not incorporated in any kind of, let's say, bibliography in academic circles here in Europe. How is that? How is your experience in that regard? Do you manage to get any kind of a voice in kind of an opening in the academic circuit when you talk about alternative perspectives on any historical topic?
Well, I have also, of course, I have long been in an academic environment in the Netherlands and in Europe and in Argentina. And I think that I've always found the academic environment suffocating. Suffocating in a very, often in a subtle sense, often in a less subtle sense, but always suffocating. And I've studied in America, and it was very suffocating there. They didn't even admit discussion in the United States, especially when it came to American quote unquote history. Okay, it was impossible to discuss. That's why I didn't proceed studying American history, because it was impossible to work with the people there. They didn't admit different points of view. And I think that in general, the academic environment is not conducive to, certainly as it has come to be during the 20th century, is not conducive to open debate, because many people in academia, they're reluctant to give their real thoughts on controversial issues touching on their own subject and specialty, because they want to get ahead in their careers. And the only thing to get ahead in your career in academia is to be in line with what the boss, the honcho, the professor, the leading professor says and wants and thinks. Don't contradict him at all. And if you do that, you have a chance to go to the next level and to make a career. So there's always that, especially in the Netherlands. I found it's very pronounced. Well, I may not say anything bad about Leiden, but it was like this in Leiden, and it was like this in other places in the Netherlands. Don't say anything that runs counter to what the head honcho of the department thinks, believes, and wants. And that's the same. It must be the same now as always. Now worse, I think.
I think, of course, that is probably an eternal characteristic of all institutions. That, let's say, the loudest voice and the most powerful person will bend the narrative. But we have quite a lot at stake. I believe that if you deprive a culture, society of its history, you do damage that cannot be undone at a certain point. There will be a point at which it cannot be done. Let's, for example, look at the American Indians. And they lost their language, they lost their religion, and they lost their oral traditions. At that point, they were shipwrecked. They became like driftwood, unable to recover any kind of coherent identity. Nations that were, in a certain sense, bound to die out, which also with a physical effect as well. And I think you can see similar things in Europe happening. So the same kind of things that are happening to the Australian Aboriginals, that are happening to the American Indians. So they stopped having children. They become addicted. They become obese. They become sedentary. They stop their martial tradition ends. Their women marry out of the group. There's a lot of rape, a lot of killing, a lot of atrocities happening. We can start seeing similar things in Europe. Absolutely. From a cultural anthropological point of view, you can make a direct parallel to what has happened to the American Indians in the United States, to the Brazilian Amazon Indians, and to the Australian Aboriginals or to the Maoris, and to what is happening slowly by slowly to our own European peoples. And I think one of the reasons of that is that we are losing touch with our, I would say it in a very mythological way, with our ancestors, which of course is done through the art of history. All art and all history and all geography in the final analysis is sacred. It's sacred to the people that carry that history, that live in that geography. And the moment that that respect falls away and that experience falls away, people become unmoored, unhinged. What you were talking about, like there's a kind of a collective madness, which is of course first seen in the elites, which fail us, but also starts to take on mass proportion. And I think this is a very dangerous development, because there will be a point in which this is irreversible. And we are not yet at that point, as you say. There are still archives, there are still people able to speak languages, to read sources, to pose a counter-narrative, but for how long will this still take place? That is something that I worry about. Your final thoughts?
Well, I share your worries about this, and I think we are past the point of no return. I think we're headed for extinction in Western Europe. The Dutch, the Belgians, the Germans, yes, the Germans very much, because they have been brainwashed on a massive scale by the Americans after the war. The poor Germans, I really feel sorry for them. And the French, they're lost causes, I think. And the only places where there's still some hopes, glimmers, is maybe in regional environments, like maybe like what you see in Asterix and Obelix in a small isolated corner of France, or what you see, I think, the Turkish series Çukur. I don't know if you saw it. Are you familiar with that? With Çukur, you seen it? Because
a little bit, I know it.
Yes, because it's about the how a local family in a neighborhood of Istanbul controls life there and acts like a local lord. They allow everything that runs counter to the law, except prostitution and drugs. Everything else is allowed, but they ensure that the people are safe and that they have enough to eat, that they have a roof above their heads. So they're very much, it's a thriving community, but it's isolated from the rest. And I think that's the future of Europe. We'll find these sort of things reproduced in Europe. It's the way the mafia operates in many places in southern Italy. And it's also what has been predicted by Israeli historian Martin van Creveld. He says Europe will be heading back to the Middle Ages and it will fall apart. And you may be lucky when you live in a region like Çukur, operated and run by a morally respectable family that tries to live up to its reputation and noblesse oblige, and to do as a nobleman would do in the Middle Ages, so as a noble local lord would do. We're heading for that sort of an environment. I think that's the only way out for Europe. From there, may something new may arise, because European nations, of course, they're conglomerates of regions, and that can also be nations in their own right, like Lombardy, or like Bavaria, or like Brittany, or Languedoc. It's not to say that the European nations, as they are now, are destined for eternal existence. They can also split apart into smaller versions, like reverting back to an earlier period in the Middle Ages. So I think that's the only hope and the only way ahead for Europe. Maybe you agree. I don't know.
Yeah, well, obviously you're right. So the fall of an empire, the fall of nation states, is also the moment ethnogenetic processes started. Yeah, so yes. That the fall of the Western Roman Empire was also the birth of Western Europe. So you're right in that respect, of course. But of course, we will complete our talk for today. We congratulate our audience that they were able to listen for more than 7 minutes, because that's the attention span that's average now. And that they were able to listen to our pretty explorative talk about the bibliography and the historiography of the Great War. Of course, I want to end on a positive note. We are talking here for Arktos. So Hans just said it may be that extinction is what's looming for us. Well, I would say if that's the case, then let's go out on a bang instead of a whimper. Let's go out in grand style. Europe has that. Our empires did fall, but they fell in style, and I think we could do the same. They say that a small nation called Israel has a Samson option. Perhaps we will invent that for ourselves as well, and we'll take our enemies down with us at some point. In any case, we will continue the good fight here at Arktos. We advise you to read all the beautiful books that are being put out by our publisher, and to enjoy much of the ancient culture of Europe that's preserved in them. Having said that, I thank you, Hans, for participating today and for this first lecture, Arktos Academy. Thank you.
Thanks all.